Around the barrel, I saw what had to be Mark in my former body. I was so tiny now, barely the size of my new huge hand. Mark lay there on his back, looking up with a stunned expression. "Who are you?" he asked in a tiny, tiny voice, then his eyes widened at the sound of my voice coming from his throat. "It's me, Mark." I winced also. A look of confusion crossed his small face. "But I'm Mark." I laughed a little. "No, I mean, Mark, it's me, Emily. That kid swapped our bodies." Mark sat up slowly, examining his new arms and legs, and lingered curiously on his new chest. Finally, he squinted up at me. "Is that my body? It looks different." "I think you'll discover that a lot of things look different." "I sure have. You've shrunk to about 6 inches high after all." "What happened to the kid?" I shook my head. "He took off. Goodness only knows where he is now. We've got to get back to the car and call in some backup." I struggled to my feet and almost fell when another wave dizziness hit. I've been up far higher than this before, but it's different when your feet are still on the ground. Mark stood up as well on my tiny little feet, and then stopped, looking way up at me. How do I do it?" "Fly, I mean." Well, that was an odd question. I'd never really given that any thought before. Pixies are born with instinctive knowledge of how to fly. I was never even aware of doing anything. Well, I'm not sure exactly. I just always just did it. "Sorry, I guess that's not much help, is it? Try jumping or something." He rolled his eyes at me, I think. They were so small it was hard to tell for certain. I'll have to remember how hard it is to see my facial expressions for humans. He looked down at his feet, and then over his shoulder at the thin insect-like wings on his back. He shrugged his shoulders up and down and back and forth. Soon the wings began to twitch a little. He squatted down and then leapt as hard as he could. Unfortunately, he was still not fully aware of a pixie's strength-to-weight ratio, and he launched himself about 20 feet in the air. While falling back to earth, he tried frantically to beat his wings. I rushed to catch him, but found myself unable to stop my own momentum. Guess I'm not the only one having strength-to-weight ratio problems, and tripped over a rock. That's a new experience. I've never tripped before. Now that I've tried it, I think I'll leave it to the professionals. In the meantime, Mark had managed to get his wings going, but still had no directional control, and was weaving all over the place, sometimes upside down. Finally, he reached the wall of the adjacent building, which stopped his first flight rather abruptly. Fortunately, we pixies are fairly resilient, and he escaped with little damage. Slowly and tentatively, I walked over to where Mark was sitting on the pavement. He looked up at me with a wry grin. "Maybe I ought to just ride on your shoulder for a bit, until I get the hang of it." We made our way back to the car, having only minor difficulties getting over the fence. I thumped my head on the roof of the car as I attempted to get into the driver's seat. Mark stood on my hand as I reached over to place him in my little seat. He settled in and looked back at me. "So, what now? Do we look for the kid?" I shook my head. "I don't think we're in any kind of condition to be hunting down anyone. We'd better get back to the station and see if they can reverse this." Mark nodded, so I turned forward and just sat there for a moment, waiting. Emily?" I looked over to Mark. "You have to drive." I laughed sheepishly, sounding odd in Mark's voice. "Oh yeah, where are the keys?" "In your right front pocket. The silver one with the square head goes in the ignition." I reached into the pocket to retrieve the keys, and while I was in there, my hand felt something else through the cloth that made me quite uncomfortable. I quickly pulled my hand away, deciding not to think about it right then. We had to get out of there, so I pulled out the keys. I fit the silver key into the slot, mimicking the motions I had seen my partner make so many times before. The engine screeched horribly as I turned the key. Mark winced at the sound. "You have to engage the clutch and give it a little gas." I tried again and managed to start the engine, only to have it stall immediately upon shifting into first gear. My third try sent us hurtling into a mailbox on the sidewalk. I looked over at Mark with a helpless expression. "Maybe we'd better just call for another unit." "Why didn't you stun him?" The chief's disembodied voice was yelling at us from wherever he actually existed. He seemed fairly angry, but no more so than when his coffee isn't prepared properly. Officer transforms were not uncommon in our line of work, but that didn't mean they were ignored. Mark and I sat in the chief's office, me in a chair, and Mark on top of a paperweight on the desk. Frankly, I'm not sure why a non-corporeal, disembodied voice needs a desk, or an office for that matter, but stranger things in heaven and earth and all that, I guess. Well, we had him cornered and visible. I guess I was still just hoping we could get him to cooperate without resorting to that. Mark explained in a very small voice. Then, when he went for the ring, I sent the stun bolt at him, but the first one missed, and I didn't get off a second. Chief, this ring isn't your run-of-the-mill vernal equinox special. The kid got off a full body swap directed outwardly within a second of having the ring on. No incantation or anything. Great, just great, the chief was ranting fully now. This is just fantastic. That kind of unauthorized transformation, out on the street, in that neighborhood? That kid couldn't possibly afford a ring like that unless he stole it or got an unbelievable deal. Either way, whoever has them doesn't know what they have. I spoke up at this. Chief, we need to move in as soon as possible, or else those rings are going to leave the neighborhood and go who knows where. I agree, Officer Chon-Dash, Officer Faye, but you two are obviously in no condition to be of any help, at least until you get better suited to those bodies. I want you to go down to research and try to dig up some information on the rings we may be dealing with here. Report your findings and then go to the clinic and see if they can do something about your situation here. If not, then you should go home until we need you. But Chief, I tried to fly over his desk, but obviously was no longer equipped to do anything but trip over my huge new feet and do a face plant onto the desk. I sheepishly rubbed my forehead. Right, the clinic it is. On our way out of the office, I could hear Mark trying not to laugh, so I reached over and gave him a playful nudge, smirking at the startled sound that followed. I clumped down the hall to our research library, all the while feeling like a big clumsy oaf. By this time, Mark had managed to fly in a generally straight line, although his fine control still left a lot to be desired. We pulled our copy of Enchanted Rings, a catalog and guide for the collector by Schuler and Kang the Magnificent. Fortunately, we found our ring right away. Unfortunately, it belonged to a set of 5. The 5 rings each contained a different transformative power: age, gender, size, shape, and swap. The rings had been created back in the 40s as part of the war effort. They had not been given a traditional magical classification, but were instead merely known as Project Chameleon. Top secret, naturally. Of course, they had all been declassified years ago, but according to the book, they were supposed to be in a private museum in Newark. I sent Mark to find out what he could about when they went missing, while I read on. Clearly, the rings had been intended for espionage. Apparently, though, by the time they were completed, the tide had turned at the European front, and there wasn't much need for them in the Pacific arena. So the project had been closed and the rings sold to a private collector by the name of Tolkien, who was apparently really into magic rings. The chief advantage that the rings provided was the ability to perform multiple changes and to be directed at anyone the wielder was in visual contact with, a dangerous thing in the wrong hands. Usually, these street kids had small potions, or one-time cheap rings, which needed an incantation and therefore couldn't be used very quickly. These rings, though, they could be a lot of trouble. Already had been, I reminded myself. I looked down again and sighed. The size was a big change, of course, but more than that, I felt heavy. As a pixie, I could lift off, fly around the room, or hover in the corner with no effort at all. Now, though, it was as if I was glued to the ground. Merely walking across the room, while not tiring exactly, seemed like so much effort. I had to concentrate on each step, moving one leg, then the other. Getting around was never so much work. On top of that, I was, well, a man. I had never really even thought about human gender except in the abstract and in the ways they behaved differently. Pixies don't have male or female. We're all born from the great mother tree, and we all go back to tend it for a year of our lives. I suppose I must be considered female anyway, in the sense that I look like a human female, albeit only 6 inches tall and with wings. But I was certainly male now. I could feel that part of Mark's body down there, but I hadn't worked up the nerve to think too much about it. I've seen a few, in less than ideal situations, but I hadn't really given them much thought at the time. I just sat there, feeling awkward about my new body. Ahem. I looked up suddenly to see Mark standing on the table, holding a scrap of paper. I think I blushed, but I couldn't tell from inside. Mark decided to ignore it. Yes, well, this newspaper is dated 2 weeks ago, and it says that the rings were one of a couple exhibits stolen from the Newark Museum of the Bizarre. They're pretty sure it was the night security guard that did it, but they never found him. Looks like he might have made his way to our fair city. Good work, Mark. The clinic hadn't been able to do anything for us. Since the rings had been intended as a defensive tool for spies, they put a pretty powerful block on counterspells. The lab got cracking on the code, but unless we got the rings back, we were looking at a couple of months before we could change back. We reported our findings to the chief, and then he sent us home. There was no way I could fit into my little apartment now, so we both went to Mark's place uptown. It was a nice place. Mark's wife had decorated it warmly, but it was still kind of small and shabby for my tastes. Of course, my place is much smaller, but proportionally, it was easily twice the size of this place and much nicer. That's one good thing about being a pixie in the city. Rent is cheap. No sooner than we closed the door, Mark's wife, Karen, rushed in with a big "Hi, sweetie," and planted a quick kiss right on my lips. She held it a moment, and I just stood there, stunned, though it was unexpectedly pleasant. Soon, I regained my composure and stumbled backwards, pulling away from her and falling on my oversized frame. I tell you, this falling thing takes some getting used to. Karen looked shocked and hurt. I looked up at her and I didn't know what to say. Fortunately, Mark flew in and told her what had happened. Oh, Mark. She seemed near tears. Why did this have to happen tonight? We were supposed to have dinner with the Forsters tonight. I'm sorry, honey, you know I'd be there if there was any way that I could. I'm not happy about this either. She looked to her shrunken, winged husband with longing, then turned to me and hugged me tightly. I looked over to Mark to see what I should do, but he just shrugged. All I could think of was that her hair smelled nice, and I wondered what conditioner she used, until I noticed an awkward reaction from my borrowed body. Karen seemed to notice too, and quickly stepped back. Oh, Emily, I'm sorry. She looked mortified. I have to check something in the kitchen. With that, she rushed away. Mark looked confused. What was that all about? Then he glanced at me and seemed to realize. His mouth gaped open in surprise, and I'm sure I blushed. Eventually, Karen came back into the living room, having regained her composure. So, Emily, will you join us for a late lunch? You're welcome to the sandwich I had made for Mark. What does Mark eat now? Thankful for a change of subject, I sighed in relief. Oh, a leaf of lettuce maybe with a side of honey, or a sugar cube, if you have them. The meal was relatively uneventful until I realized that there was meat in my sandwich and accidentally spit it out in surprise. I apologized immediately and offered to clean it up, but Karen had already taken care of it. I removed the meat from my sandwich and added an extra lettuce leaf and tomato slice. After that, we continued eating in an awkward silence. After lunch, Karen suggested a movie to calm us all down, but Mark reminded her that we had to wait for the chief's call. Fortunately, we didn't have long to wait. The department sent a car by to pick us up, because although we were getting around all right in general, I still wasn't up for driving. When we arrived at the station, we learned that a no-knock teleport raid was already in preparation. I was initially confused as to how they got the no-knock approved, but apparently they could center in on the exact location of the ring that transformed us by tracing the residual magic signature left behind on Mark and I, which meant we were going along. We got suited up in the standard gear for magic den raids, spell-shielded body armor for torso and legs, fast-acting stun wands, and an emergency escape spell in case of injury or unexpected transformation, which could be activated locally or by the supervising officer back at the station. The research officer scanned us and uttered the incantation. We appeared suddenly in a small, cruddy apartment. The suspects inside were taken quickly, and we secured the apartment with only minor injuries. A girl in her early 20s, dressed for the street, had managed to get off an unfocused shot with the gender ring, but since all our people were in body armor, only exposed body parts were affected: the head, neck, hands, and legs below the knee. I was transformed again, still in Mark's body, plus one other officer was affected, but her boyfriend, who turned out to be the security guard from the Newark Museum, hadn't been so lucky and was fully transformed into a distinctly feminine appearance. We searched the apartment and managed to find only 2 of the rings remaining, the gender ring and the age ring. Thankfully, the woman turned out to be the kid's mother, and the swap ring was soon recovered when the kid walked in. Mark and I swapped back immediately, and I couldn't help but chuckle at the sight of Mark with a mismatched head and hands before that was also restored. We had been right about the original burglary. It wasn't a burglary at all. The security guard had tried to sell the stolen rings to the kid at the spell shop, but the negotiations went sour and the kid got a shot with the change ring. A magically altered appearance and a small pig's tail had taught the kid a lesson about dealing with criminals, but he hadn't done anything else except file a phony police report, so we decided to leave him as he was and be done with it. The security guard had then desperately tried to unload the rings on the street and had gotten less than $40 for the 2 of them. He was sentenced to 3 years in the magical labor pits for stealing the rings and assaulting an officer. We never found the other 2 rings, and we also heard that the 2 we had recovered disappeared off the truck on their way back to the museum. Not too surprising, really. Sets of magical rings are only easy to deal with when they're together. Separate them, and they have a way of leaving to look for the rest. By now, they're too far gone to spend a lot of time looking for them, but I'm sure that someone will find them eventually. Mark and I were even closer as partners after our time spent as each other. I had a better understanding of what he was capable of physically, and he better understood what I went through as a 6-inch police officer. After switching back, Karen and Mark invited me to their dinner party with them. I politely declined. The truth is, I just wanted to go back to my little place in the park, take a bath, and thank the goddess for not making me human.